All right, let's call Isaiah 33 stability, understanding that this chapter seems to build on that principle of simple math from the previous chapter, in which we observed that sometimes we don't want to complicate life by ignoring the simple fundamentals that things like justice and righteousness produce things like stability. In this chapter that begins with verse 1, talking about the ways in which those who have been allowed to destroy and betray without seeing those kinds of consequences are now going to see those kinds of consequences, as they will now see a day of destruction and betrayal, leading to verses 2 and 4, offering a kind of prayer to God, reminiscent of the way we saw David pray in the Psalms, asking God to be gracious. As verses 5 and 6 will go on to talk about the way in which Zion will be filled with, as we've already mentioned, justice and righteousness, producing stability, thus the title, among other things, but even beyond stability, salvation, wisdom, and knowledge in abundance. As verses 7 through 12 will go on to talk about, once again, that familiar theme, the desolation that goes along with his days of cleansing and judgment. In that series of verses 7 through 12, he's going to pause to say that in the midst of that desolation, in verse 10, now he will arise to set the stage for what seems to be the rest of the chapter, as verses 13 through 24 will call his people to do two things. One, hear, and then see. That first call to hearing, running from verses 13 through 16, talking about the way he is going to ask them to hear a specific thing. Who is it that will be able to dwell in this environment of restored peace? At which point he is going to answer, he who walks righteously, once again, and talks uprightly, who rejects oppression and bribes as a means of gain or gaining advantage or success, but likewise closes his ears and eyes to things that simply distract from the places of real value, the places that God is preparing for his people. Things described in, I think it's verses 17 through 20, where he says, your eyes will see the king in his beauty, in a land that stretches far, where you will no longer see the insolent, but your heart will ponder essentially what has become of those who were once functioning as tyrants over us, where he will go on to describe the way in which you will see Zion and Jerusalem untroubled, and maybe just as importantly, forgiven. The thing that most caught my attention, quite possibly being the way he describes the path, or what seems to be the path to the happy place or happier times in Zion, where verse 14 will say, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? Who among us can dwell with the everlasting burnings? Something that sounds a lot like the unhappy place, or hell, the lake of fire, for lack of a better term. But in describing happier times in Zion, there is still a burning that must be endured. Now, all that different from the very last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, that describes God as sitting as a refiner's fire, burning away the impurities of his people, understanding that heaven and the New Jerusalem are not described as places where we can simply do whatever we want. And it's fun because we just have that level of, as we mentioned in the last chapter, freedom. No, it's a place where we have peace because we can actually trust the environment around us, which means to a certain degree, it requires a burning off of the toxic and unhealthy things within us that threaten the peace of that kind of perfection. Pointing back to a part of the verse that describes the stability that God is providing for his people in verses 5 and 6, where the end of verse 5 and 6 says, the fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure, reminding me of the way we started out our discussion of Isaiah, simply saying that we will not be saved on our own terms. Understanding that more than once, God seems to describe himself as a consuming fire who has prepared a process by which he makes us a perfect fit with a place of perfect peace.